Europe is planning a massive hike in defense spending to counter the threat from Russia, and Germany is leading the way. On Friday, the upper house of the German parliament gave the green light to an almost unlimited increase in defense spending. Lawmakers also said yes to an infrastructure fund worth €500 billion. All of this comes a day after the European Union agreed to hike defense spending by €800 billion. These are huge sums of money, and some of it will be spent right here in Germany. We have this report.
Now that Germany is set to unleash spending, what will the funds be used for?
Whatever it takes.
That was a reference to defence. New military spending will go to civil protection, IT security, intelligence, and aid for illegally attacked states, a clear commitment to financial support for Ukraine. Germany's defence minister is adamant that Berlin has to step up.
We Germans will have to play a central role in Europe. All European capitals see it that way. And that means more troops, more equipment, more rapid deployment. And in short, this will require a massive increase in funding.
It's not just defence that will get a boost. A special €500 billion fund is set aside for infrastructure spending. There are competing demands from all directions, ranging from small-scale projects to larger tasks.
Anyone who travels in our country, whether by train or by car, can sense that something is no longer working well. If you have children at school and in daycare, you can see the investment backlog. Our country is running on wear and tear.
Whether it's for broken bridges and dilapidated railway tracks, or repairs to the local school's roof, this chunk of cash comes with conditions. The investments have to be sustainable, as Germany plans to enshrine in the constitution that it will aim for climate neutrality by 2045. But there's still a lot to discuss, not least how much money will be pinned down for each and every project.
And our coverage continues now with Marina Miron. She's a military analyst from King's College London. She joins us tonight from Munich. Marina, it's good to see you. It's been a very good week for defense hawks here in Europe. Massive defense spending hikes right here in Germany. So what are they going to spend all that money on?
Good evening, Brent. Likewise. Well, that's the question, actually. What is this money going to be spent on fundamentally? There are some talks about investing into infrastructure. However, there is no clarity in terms of what exactly will be purchased, what capabilities need strengthening. And I think it's a much broader topic about what role is Germany going to play within NATO and what kind of war should we be preparing for in the future. And that's how you would adjust the capabilities and fill the gaps, especially now with the United States offering a lot of capabilities on which NATO depends, such as logistics, such as operational command. So you have to develop those capabilities if you are not going to rely on the United States anymore. But the other question is how quickly can you turn that money into actual capabilities in terms of arms, but also what about the human factor? How do you get people to join the military? How do you get people to fight? And I think that question is much more difficult to solve, and it cannot be solved with just pouring money into it.
Well, I mean, you pick up on the second question I was going to pose here. I mean, you'll agree with me that there is a new sense of urgency now because of acute doubts over the reliability of the U.S. defense umbrella. So is the answer to these doubts, is it simply throwing money at defense?
It is difficult because Europe has been enjoying the U.S. security umbrella, let's say, since the end of the Cold War. And the question here is, why hasn't anything been done? Why hasn't this been considered as a worst-case scenario that one day the U.S. will assume a position that is not necessarily pro-European, and then Europe will be left alone? So Europe has been sleepwalking, so to say, into this situation where now things need to be done quickly, but they cannot be done quickly because we know that the European Union plans to purchase domestically, excluding NATO members such as the UK and Turkey, for instance. And European industry, defense industry, is not even close to being on par with, say, the US defense industry. So I don't think that pouring money on it is going to solve those fundamental problems. And as I said, it's not just a problem of weapon systems, it's also a problem of manpower.
Europe has identified Russia as the main threat. Are European militaries, are they even at a basic level ready to face that threat, speaking of manpower?
Well, if we look at statistics, for instance, in terms of how much goes into the defense spending, when we compare the entire NATO bloc to Russia, NATO invests more, NATO has more, say, fighter jets. However, these are not the only determining factors. And the problem is we're seeing the war in Ukraine, and we're trying to project what a potential war against Russia would look like. And it looks like it will be a war of attrition. It will be a very long and slow war. Now, that is not the kind of war that NATO is prepared to fight. NATO is prepared to fight very short campaigns where it has air superiority, using long-range munitions. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is that a lot of NATO weapons have been rendered obsolete, with the Russians using electronic warfare systems, which are much cheaper than the weapons supplied to the Ukrainians. So fundamentally, I don't think that also in terms of the will to fight, that NATO is capable now of fighting that kind of war. And it doesn't have, especially if we take the US out of the equation, the capabilities to do so, because the Russians will be exploiting those asymmetries.
And if I'm understanding you correctly, Marina, what you're saying is if we had seen these types of spending hikes take place during the first Trump administration, we would be having a completely different conversation now, wouldn't we?
Possibly. It depends on how it all is materialized and how it all is executed. For instance, when we're talking about the European defense sector, it means that European companies want to see long-term contracts signed by European governments. However, European governments are dragging their feet. So you have to completely change the mindset in order to prepare your country for defense. And I think the basic function of every government is to ensure a defense of its territorial jurisdiction. So in other words, it is not just about defense policies, it's also about energy policies, it's also about education, it's also about strategic culture. So I think there are a lot of factors that should have been addressed. And 2016, probably that's even too late. I think the time to do that would have been after the end of the Cold War, starting to slowly move away and creating a different security infrastructure within the European Union.
Let me ask you then about Germany. It has been boosting defense spending since after the full Russian invasion of Ukraine. Have we seen a significant boost in actual military capabilities of the military-industrial base?
From as far as I can tell, not as much. For instance, Rheinmetall was planning to open more plants, also plants in Ukraine. That hasn't happened yet, and it's all is dependent on the global supply chain, which has been disrupted, on the prices of raw materials and access of raw materials, on the energy prices. So despite the rhetoric and despite the actions, yes, you can pour money into it, but the question is translating that money into actual capabilities. And this is something that I'm still missing. And I think it will take a long time until we see some sort of results from this. Depends, of course, on what the priorities will be of the German government and how this money will be allocated and where. Let
me ask you before we run out of time, Marina, even if the soon-to-be Next, German Chancellor, we presume, Friedrich Merz, if he has questioned U.S. reliability, do you see Germany aiming for the type of independence from the Americans that France is advocating for?
Well, we have to remember that France has different capabilities, and France has a different defense industry compared to Germany. I think it's the world's third weapons exporting country in terms of rankings. And France also has nuclear weapons, which Germany doesn't have. So I don't see Germany pursuing that very same path, because German capabilities and the neglect of the armed forces for the past, say, 20 years hasn't been seen in France. Therefore, we cannot compare the French position to the German position. Germany doesn't have those assets, and therefore it will probably be very different and still dependent on the U.S.
Military analyst Marina. Marina, we appreciate your valuable analysis on this Friday night. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.